All right, so today we're going to deep dive into this whole one nation, one election thing that's been kicking around. I mean, just imagine it. Every single election in India, all the states, the Lok Sabha, everything, all happening at the same time. It's a pretty wild idea when you think about the scale of it.
Yeah, it's certainly ambitious.
I mean, on the one hand, you can definitely see the appeal. Fewer elections would probably mean fewer expenses, less disruption, less of that whole election mode that seems to grip the country every few months. And logistically, it has a kind of, I don't know, a cleanness to it. Like, just get it all done at once.
Yeah, I get that. It sort of seems like it would make things more efficient, at least on the surface.
But then you hear someone like former Delhi High Court Chief Justice A.P. Shah, and he's not mincing words. He's calling this Ono-E thing a potential constitutional dumpster fire, and that's definitely not something you just brush off.
No, not at all. And when you consider Justice Shah's background, his experience not only as Chief Justice but also at the helm of the Law Commission, it's clear he's not just throwing around dramatic phrases. He knows the Indian legal system inside and out, and his strong reaction suggests that this proposal could have some serious implications.
Okay, so I promise this isn't going to turn into some boring legal jargon fest. We're going to try to break this down, explore the arguments, and figure out what the heck is going on with this whole Ono-E debate.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because it seems like things really came to a head in that Joint Parliamentary Committee, the JPC meeting. You had Justice Shah going head-to-head with senior advocate Harish Salve, basically two legal heavyweights with very different takes on this whole thing. It's kind of like a showdown over the future of India's elections.
Yeah, you could definitely say that. On the one hand, you've got Justice Shah, and his main concern seems to be protecting the core principles of the Constitution. He's worried about unintended consequences and potential chaos. And then you have Mr. Salve, who's focused on the practical aspects, arguing that Ono-E can actually work and that it wouldn't necessarily violate the Constitution. So you've got these two very different perspectives clashing, which makes it all the more fascinating.
So let's unpack Justice Shah's objections first. From what I understand, he really didn't hold back in that JPC meeting, calling the Ono-E bill unconstitutional and saying it poses a threat to democracy and India's federal structure. What exactly is he so worried about?
Well, a big part of it is the potential impact on the relationship between the central government and the states. India's federal system is built on this delicate balance of power. And elections for state assemblies, that's a state matter, constitutionally speaking. So anything that could be seen as the central government, meddling with the timing of those elections, that raises some serious questions about states' rights and autonomy.
Yeah, it's interesting because the bill would actually give the Election Commission the power to postpone state elections if needed to sync them up with the Lok Sabha polls.
Yeah.
And Shah sees this as a huge problem, almost like a power grab by the center.
Yeah.
Why is he so concerned about this specific point?
Think about it this way. If the Election Commission, which ultimately answers to the central government, can change the schedule of state elections, that means they could potentially shorten or lengthen the terms of state governments.
Right.
I mean, that's a pretty big deal. Imagine a state elects a government they're supposed to serve for 5 years, but then to align with the Lok Sabha elections, their term gets cut short. Or, flip it around, an unpopular government might get an extension. It basically makes state governments' terms dependent on the national election calendar, and Shah argues that just throws a wrench into the whole idea of a fixed term, which is a pretty fundamental democratic principle.
All right, so that's Justice Shah's side. Now, what about Harish Salve? He's arguing that Ono-E is both constitutional and practical. He says it's not about limiting anyone's right to vote, it's just about streamlining the process and making things more efficient. What's his justification for saying it's constitutional?
Well, he probably argues that the Constitution mandates free and fair elections, and synchronizing them could actually improve the process
Well,
by reducing disruption, by letting governments focus on governing instead of constantly being in campaign mode, things like that.
Yeah.
He might say that Ono-E would actually enhance democracy by leading to better governance.
but even Salve ran into some pushback during that JPC meeting. DMK MPP Wilson straight up asked him if Ono-E violates the basic structure of the Constitution, which is a pretty loaded question. And Salve admitted that Ono-E is what he called conditional legislation.
Right.
So what does that actually mean?
It means that how Ono-E actually works, and even whether it's legal, might depend on specific conditions and on how the courts interpret it, how it fits with other laws, and of course, the Constitution. So it's not as simple as saying it's definitely constitutional or unconstitutional. There's a lot of nuance there, a lot of things that could affect how it plays out in reality. It sounds like even Salve acknowledges that it's not a cut and dry issue.
Yeah, and you can't forget the logistics of this whole thing. Holding simultaneous elections across India, with all its diversity and sheer size, it seems mind-bogglingly complex.
It really is. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of millions of voters, different languages, geographical challenges, potential for natural disasters in some areas.
Right.
Just ensuring that the elections are conducted fairly and securely on such a massive scale would be a huge undertaking.
And that 5-hour JPC meeting, Salve presenting his arguments for 3 hours, Shah countering for 2, it sounds intense. I mean, the committee chairman called the meeting positive, which seems kind of odd given the clear disagreement. What do you make of that?
I guess positive could mean different things in this context. Maybe it just means the discussion was respectful despite the differing views. Or maybe it means that everyone was open to hearing each other out, even if they didn't agree. It doesn't necessarily mean they reached a consensus or anything like that.
And it's worth noting that Salve was actually part of the committee that first proposed simultaneous elections, so he's obviously invested in defending the idea. Shah, on the other hand, has been skeptical from the start.
Right.
So you really do have this fundamental clash of viewpoints.
Yeah, you have someone who helped create the proposal, arguing for its merits, and then you have a respected legal expert who, even after being consulted, still has serious doubts. It shows that this is far from a settled issue, even among people who really understand this stuff.
One of Shah's biggest concerns is the impact on state governments' terms. He's worried that to make everything line up with the Lok Sabha elections, some state governments could be cut short, while others could be extended. And he sees that as a major problem. Why is that such a big deal?
It all comes down to the principle of fixed terms in a democracy. When people vote for a government, they expect it to serve for a specific period of time.
Right.
And if those terms can be changed just to fit the national election schedule, it really undermines that whole concept. It creates uncertainty and makes it harder for voters to hold their state governments accountable.
So let's say a state holds elections in 2025. The government's term is supposed to end in 2030. But then, because of the Lok Sabha elections in 2027, they might have to hold elections early. Or maybe a state government that's not very popular gets to stay in power longer than expected. It just seems like it throws the whole system out of whack.
Exactly. And Shah raises another crucial point. What happens if a state government collapses before its term is up? Let's say they lose a vote of no confidence. Do you hold new elections right away and try to resync with the national schedule? What if that throws everything off? Or do you have some kind of temporary solution? It seems like a lot of these practical questions haven't really been answered yet, which makes it even more concerning.
The government's main argument for ONOE is that it will save a ton of money, but Shah isn't buying it. He thinks it's more about PR than actual cost savings, especially when you consider how much the government spends on other things.
Yeah, and when you really look at the logistics, it's not clear if the cost savings would be as big as they claim. I mean, to pull off an election of this scale, you'd need a massive increase in security, more polling stations, a huge logistical operation, and if anything goes wrong, you need backup plans, which all costs money. So it's not as simple as saying fewer elections, less money. There's a lot more to it than that.
It's fascinating that even though Shah is so critical of ONOE, he hasn't really offered a specific alternative. I wonder why that is.
Well, creating a whole new electoral system for a country like India is a monumental task.
Right.
It would require a ton of political will, expertise, and careful consideration. Maybe Shah's focus right now is on highlighting the potential problems with ONOE rather than coming up with a complete solution of his own.
So let's zoom out a bit. It's interesting to remember that India actually used to have synchronized elections in the early years after independence. Why did we move away from that system?
Back then, things were a lot less stable politically, especially at the state level.
Okay.
You had more coalition governments, governments collapsing, president's rule being imposed, and all that meant that state elections started happening at different times. So the current staggered system kind of evolved organically out of that political reality. It wasn't really a planned thing, it just happened that way.
And that brings us back to Shah's concerns about federalism. He's worried that ONOE could give the central government too much power over the states just by influencing when they hold elections.
Yeah, that's a big worry, especially for states that really value their autonomy and regional identity.
Right.
Being able to hold their own elections lets them focus on local issues and dynamics without being overshadowed by national politics. But if state elections are tied to the Lok Sabha cycle, you could see national issues and national leaders dominating the conversation. And that could hurt regional parties and state-specific agendas. It might even lead to a kind of homogenization of politics, where everything becomes about national issues and local concerns get pushed aside.
And what about the voters? I mean, one of the arguments for ONOE is that people would get tired of voting so often. But are there downsides for voters too?
Yeah, I mean, fewer elections might sound appealing at first, but you have to think about the potential trade-offs. When state and national elections happen together, there is a real chance that national issues and personalities will overshadow
I
everything.
see.
And voters might not pay as much attention to local issues or the performance of their state governments. It's like if your state government is doing a bad job, but the national party they're aligned with is popular, they might get a free pass just because of the national mood.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then there's just the logistical nightmare of holding all these elections at once. India is such a vast and complex country with so many different regions and languages.
It's hard to even imagine how they would pull it off. I mean, you'd need a massive increase in resources, more polling booths, more security, and a foolproof plan to make sure everything runs smoothly. And if there's a natural disaster or some kind of major technical glitch, it could throw the whole thing into chaos.
So let's say just for a moment that everything goes perfectly. High voter turnout, cost savings, stable governments, everything UNOE supporters hope for. Even then, you still have to worry about what happens if a state government collapses midterm or if the timing of state elections gets manipulated for political gain. It just doesn't seem like a perfect system is even possible.
You're absolutely right. Even in a best case scenario, there are still so many potential pitfalls. And given India's political landscape, with all its complexities and regional differences, achieving that perfect scenario seems incredibly unlikely. The risks are just too high, and the potential for things to go wrong is too great.
So to wrap this up, one nation, one election is clearly a huge idea with potentially huge consequences. Justice Shah's warnings about the constitutional implications, the impact on federalism, and the importance of state elections are definitely something to think about seriously.
I think you raise some really crucial points about the potential risks of such a major change. The balance of power between the center and the states, the need for accountability at the state level, the integrity of the electoral process. These are all fundamental to India's democracy. And it's important to consider whether ONOE might jeopardize those principles.
And even though Harish Salve presents a strong case for the practicality and constitutionality of ONOE, the concerns raised by critics like Justice Shah are not something we can just ignore.
It's clear that there are valid arguments on both sides of this issue, but at the end of the day, it's a decision that will have profound implications for India's democracy, and it's something that needs to be carefully considered and debated from all angles.
So, here's what I'm wondering. With all the potential benefits and risks, what are the most important things about India's electoral system that we need to protect? And how do we balance the desire for efficiency with the need for democratic representation, especially in a country as diverse as India? It's a tough question, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
It's a question that everyone needs to grapple with. What aspects of India's democracy are non-negotiable for you? And how can we ensure that any changes to the electoral system, however well-intentioned, don't undermine those core principles? That's something I hope everyone listening will think about as this debate continues.